Okay, chapter 5, more photo tricks. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at some more things that you can do in Photoshop with photographs. In this case, we're going to look at how we can combine multiple images into one. In this case, it'll be panoramas, HDR or high dynamic range photos, or a sky replacement. While we're doing that, we're going to look at how we can more easily organize a bunch of those files into stacks and other types of groups to make it easier for us to see what we're doing. So like right now, we have 44 images right here, but we're only going to generate a handful out of here. So like, how can I organize this in Bridge to make it a little bit easier? So if you haven't already, navigate to wherever you have your chapter 5 files. In my case, they were on my desktop in my workbook folder and in chapter 5. In Bridge, let's go ahead and start making sets. So I can group these things into set stacks to make it easier to see what's going on. And if you need to, what you can do is you can zoom in using this little slider right here, and that will allow you to see the file names because we're going to do this based on the file name. So I have HDR, JPEG 1, 2, and 3. So I will click on the first one. I will hold down the Shift key, and I'll click on the third one. So I have all three selected. And I will hit Command or Control G on my keyboard to create a stack. Similarly, I can come up to the Stack menu and click Group as Stacks. I'm going to repeat for Chapter 5 book HDR1 RAW through 3. And group. Then I have a bunch of panorama ones. So this one's a little bit easier to mess up because I have JPEGs and DNGs, that open source RAW file. So you want to get 13 JPEGs. And I'm going to hit Command G to group it together. So I'm clicking on the first raw one now, so the .dng, and I will shift click onto the 13 one down here. I will hit Command or Control G to group them together. Then I have my two sky replacement pictures. I'm going to leave these separate because it'll be a little bit easier for us. Actually, no, let's go ahead and group them. Group. And let's group our do-it-yourself files. And we are now ready to start working. So notice that we went from 44 items down to 8 items, making it much easier for us to see what we're going to be doing in this chapter. Now, as a stack, there's a number up here in the top left that tells me how many images are in that stack. I can click that number to expand it open to see the individual images. I can work with the top image by simply clicking on only the top image, or I can work with the entire stack by clicking on the back square, which will then select all three. So like as we send these into Camera Raw and Photoshop, I'll be talking about making a selection of the files. Make sure instead of just clicking on the top image, you are clicking on that back image for the stack so you get the whole stack selected. All right, so we already have a RAW version and a JPEG version of our HDR, a RAW version and JPEG version of our panorama. And then we have RAW for our photo swap, or sky swap, excuse me, that we'll do here in a minute. To get started, let's take a look at RAW, and then we'll do this similar edit in JPEG. So I'm going to click that back image for my Chapter 5 book HDR RAW grouped stack, and I'll go ahead and click Send to Photoshop, although actually in my case I need to right-click, and I want to open this with regular Photoshop rather than the beta version. Now, even before I start doing any edits, something that you want to keep in mind when doing these kind of conversions, where we're combining multiple images into one, is that we don't want to apply any edits to these before we combine them, because applying edits to them can mess things up. So for this to work correctly, I'm not going to make any edits yet. I'm just going to start by combining. So I'll click on the first image so it's active, and I will shift click onto the third image. So I have all three of these active now. And I'll right click on any of the images, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to pick Merge to HDR. So last chapter we talked about like how if you took a picture of a window, you could have either the outside or the inside exposed correctly. RAW would let you push that a little bit further. HDR pushes that even further. You can actually take a much wider range using HDR techniques than what our eyeballs can see in terms of light. So you take a dark exposure and a light exposure, and then using HDR merge, you can combine the two together. Tools for it are pretty simple. Over here on the right, we have align images, apply auto settings, and then deghosting. So align images is used for if you were trying to handhold this image when you were taking it. So normally good photo practice would be to set down a tripod, put your camera on it, and then take the 3 different exposures, in this case, a dark, a mid, and a light. Now, if you're hand holding that, there's going to be some movement as you're taking those pictures. And so align images will try to align that together. Now, if you have a lot moving through your image, align will often fail, or if you move too much, parallax will cause issues and your image will look bad. Then we have apply auto settings. Honestly, like I'm not a big fan of auto for most cases, but auto settings here works pretty well. So we'll leave that on. Then we also have deghost. So suppose like I had like a swan that was moving through the Jean Leahy Mall here. I would need to use deghost to remove that swan. So what happened is I'd have like a ghost swan, and a ghost swan for each position that it was in. So if I turn deghost on, it will look for stuff that's moving through the image and then try to figure out how to basically remove it and keep the image looking correct. So I can turn on deghost and we can turn on high, and we can see that it's detecting movement down here from the water flowing and the rain landing on the water. For this image, we'll go ahead and just leave it on high just so we can kind of look at this kind of area. It gets a little you can see it's a little smeared now from trying to do that deghosting. We'll go ahead and click merge. I have to tell it where to merge to, and I'm just going to actually throw it into the same folder that my original pictures are in, and I'll click save. Depending on how powerful of a computer you have, this might take a few minutes to run through. So here is our final image, and we can see that it can fix a lot of the issues. Like this would be like a normal middle exposure. Here's where we exposed for the shadows, and here's where I exposed for the sky. And we can see that it very successfully puts them together. Now, once you have this put together, go ahead and come over and edit to taste. So like you'd probably want to start with, some angle stuff, trying to fix the rotation. Maybe you grab the geometry tool and you're like, maybe I want to try to straighten these buildings here in the back and see what that looks like. So just like with the other images, play around with this and see what you can get in terms of an attractive appearance for this image. Anyway, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Look at that. That actually looks better already. Standing up poorly. Oops, I don't want to mark that for deletion. Right click, turn off mark for deletion. Now, when I'm done with it, I'm not going to export it and I'm not going to open it in Photoshop. I'll simply click done, which will save any changes that I've made. And now when I go back to Bridge, we can see my finished image. Now, as I'm going to be getting ready to export out my finished images later, like I'm not going to be exporting any of these ones, but I will be exporting this. So I want to label these in a way that'll make it easier for me to find later. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on this and do label green for approve or export later. Now let's take a look at making a panorama in Camera Raw. So Camera Raw, again, is our big raw editor. We could do the JPEGs in there, but we'll do them in Photoshop. Let's take a look at doing it in RAW. So I'm going to click the back image. So I have all 13 of my images selected. You guys can go ahead and click this button right here. I'm going to go ahead and right click and do open with Photoshop 2024. Just like before, I need to select all of the images down here. Since I haven't clicked on anything, I can hit Command or Control A to select all of these images. Or if you have the first one selected, you can scroll over to the right and shift click on the last one to have them all active. Just like with the other image, I'm going to right click and I'm going to pick merge to panorama this time. You can actually merge HDR panorama pictures, but that takes an enormous amount of time. So like to make this go a little bit faster and be easier on your guys' computers, I took my 5DS files and I resized them down using the DNG resizer, so it would be a little bit easier in your guys' machines. Like normally this would be even higher res and take up a comical amount of space on our computer. Okay, so we get a preview of what our panorama will look like, and we can see that there's distortion in here as it's trying to take a two-dimensional flat plane and make it, basically a circle into a two-dimensional flat plane. So we have projection as we're trying to get this out. It's like when they talk about map projection, we're kind of like doing that from the inside instead of the outside. We can also see there's a couple stitching errors down here that if we were going to use this professionally, we'd probably want to clean up. Setting-wise, over here on the side, we have spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. So this is being like, am I on the inside of a sphere? Am I on the inside of a cylinder? And then we have perspective, which often doesn't work or break. So yeah, it won't let me do perspective in this case. In most cases, for landscape photography in particular, I have found cylindrical to be very successful unless I'm doing quite a few stacks that go straight up. So like when I took this, I did like a single stack for the ground, another stack for this part of the sky, and another stack for this part of the sky. And if I was going to continue doing stacks up, I would probably pick spherical rather than cylindrical. Now we end up with this extra space around the outsides, and this is where you can kind of decide how you want to deal with this. So I can use boundary warp, which allows me to basically stretch everything into position. This can introduce a lot of errors, but honestly, it's not a bad option. We also have fill edges, which if I click this on, it will try to content aware fill in that material. If this is the option that you want to do, we can see that we get quite a few fill errors in this. I wouldn't do this here in Camera. I would pop it out like this and then open this in Photoshop and use the more robust content aware fill stuff or the generative fill stuff that we'll look at in a later chapter to fill in these spaces rather than use the Krug Smash one that's right here. For the chapter, go ahead and do boundary warp because I think that looks pretty good besides this little blup right there, and click merge. When you click merge, it'll ask you where you want to put it, and I'll go ahead and click save. And just like before, you should go through and edit this a little bit to your own taste. So like the ground right here is probably too dark. This part of the sky could probably use a little bit more whites. Over here could use a little bit more dark tones. Like how would you apply edits to this to make it a little bit more attractive? And again, if we were doing this for professional work, we would probably want to deal with this, but probably deal with it in Photoshop rather than Camera Raw. When you're done with this image, go ahead and click Done. We'll go back to Adobe Bridge. Here's my new image. I'm going to go ahead and right click on it. And I'm going to pick label and I'm going to pick green to tell me to export this later at the end of the chapter. Okay, so sometimes a photographer sometimes a photographer won't give you their raw files, which can be a good and bad thing if you're a photographer. Sometimes you don't want to give out your raw files, sometimes you do. But sometimes they're just not going to give you raw files, and they give you some JPEGs, and you're just like, why are you giving me JPEGs when raw is so much better? Or maybe you just don't have access to the raw files because they were posted on the web or something else like that, and so you need to use this without Camera Raw. So we can do this in Photoshop using, what's it called? HDR Pro or something like that. So anyway, I have these three images selected. So I've got my first image, I click on the back one, so all three are selected. I want to do this in Photoshop rather than the Camera Raw, so I'm not going to click the Camera Raw button. Instead, I'm going to go to Tools, Photoshop, and HDR Pro. HDR Pro is an older tool, so sometimes it likes to crash. Same thing with the panorama we're going to do a little bit later. It's an older tool, so it likes to crash sometimes. So if it crashes, don't be surprised. And we can see immediately that the result that we're getting out of this just isn't as good. Like the raw one does just have more data, and it makes it a lot easier for the program to merge things together. Like we're getting all sorts of weird issues in this. And some of it is just I gave you low resolution JPEGs for this to make it easier on your guys' machines. Over here on the right, we could play around with some of these settings if you wanted. There's a nasty one that used to be really popular to do, edge glow. And then you could do this other stuff that was very popular for old school, kind of really tacky HDR images. Let's not do 32-bit. 8-bit, we can see it's a little bit crunchier. Anyway, you can play around with these sliders if you want. I'm not super concerned about you guys learning like how, there we go. This is that kind of horribleness that you would see out of those early HDR pictures. You can play around with this. I'm not super worried about you guys doing edits on this. Just know that this tool is here. My advice would be is like whatever it's spitting out right here, maybe tone it down a little bit and then pop it out into Photoshop and do your editing there rather than in Camera Raw. All right, when you're happy with your image, you'll come up to File and you'll go to Save a Copy so we can make our JPEG. Notice that up here in the top, it's giving us untitled _HDR2. So unlike what we saw with the panoramas that we just made and the HDR we made in Camera Raw where it pulled the file names, it doesn't pull the file names for us in this case. So we'll go ahead and instead, we can just actually click on the old file name. Boop, and we can see how it loads it up. And instead of _1, I will do _1-3, telling me what images went into this HDR image. This is pretty good practice, by the way, is to label to include some of the original file name label in there, and then the range of the photos being used to make it easier to understand. Now notice that changed my file type up here to .jpeg, so it pulled it from here, but it's not currently a JPEG. It is currently still a Photoshop file. So if I tried to send this to somebody, the file would be corrupt and they couldn't open it. So I must come down here and pick JPEG. And then click Save. If you get this window, go ahead and just max this out and click OK. Once it's saved, go ahead and click the little arrow. We did just save the JPEG we wanted, so I'll click Don't Save. The reason why we couldn't save this directly as a JPEG, and we had to do save as a copy, by the way, is because this was 16 bits. You can't save a JPEG as 16 bits. So when we did save as a copy, it converted it down to 8-bit. So that's why it's asking us, would you like to save, even though we already saved. So here's our new image, rinse and repeat, label, green, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for our JPEG panorama. So I'll click on the bottom image, so I have all 13 selected. I'll go up to Tools, and I'll go to Photoshop, and I'll go to Photo Merge in this case. Now, Photo Merge can be used for a lot more than just creating panoramas. It can also be used for doing focus stacking and aligning up multiple pictures and other kind of goofy things like that. For us, we want to do it as a panorama. And just like in the other one, I find that cylindrical is the one that works best for landscape panoramas. This might vary depending on what you're doing. I'll frequently use reposition, like if I have like a document scanner and I'm scanning in something too big on it and I scan it in parts, or kind of other goofy things like that. And then we could click OK, but we also have these 4 check marks down here. Now, my advice when running Photo Merge to do panoramas is to go ahead and turn blend images together, because this is going to save you a lot of effort. Turn on vignette removal. So this will remove any darkening around the edges from the camera or other stuff like that that will mess up the panorama. And this is something that you could do. You can do each one of these steps later, but it's easier to do all these 3 steps here. And then geometric distortion correction, that's that optical button that we saw in Camera Raw. It's these 2 things combined. And then finally, there's content to will for transparent areas. I would leave this off. I have found, and it might have changed in these newer versions of Photoshop, but if I turn all 4 of these on, this tends to freeze. And then you have to restart Photoshop and it's a drag. And then we can do this pretty easily in Photoshop anyway, so there really isn't a huge reason to have this turned on here anyway. So I'll click OK. It's going to open and close everything, so kind of resist clicking on anything or hitting OK or enter on your keyboard or anything. It sometimes will interrupt this process. And what it's doing is it's taking all of the images, it's loading them into a single document, then it's going to look at all the images to try to figure out how to line them up. It lines them up into a larger document and then masks out areas that overlap to create our new image. Anyway, let's give it a hot second here as it thinks. And we have it merged all together now, and it looks pretty good. We got a pretty serious error right here. So, maybe we would crop that off or something like that. Or maybe we would just fill over it. But otherwise, this looks pretty good. And if we pop out the layer panel, it did exactly as I expected. You can see how it's masked off certain areas, and maybe that's where I would click on this one. Yeah, here it is at the bottom, and we can see that it really was just off on this part. In this case, probably what I would do is I would actually just crop that off. For the chapter, we'll leave it in place because it'd be a different step, but this will be easy enough. So now we need to merge all these together before we do anything else, because this file is comically huge right now, and if we merge this all together, it'll keep this from being a little slow for our computers. So I'm going to come up to Layer, and I want to do Merge Visible. I don't want to do Flatten. If I do Flatten, it'll appear like it did what I wanted, but notice how this area turned white. Versus if I go up to Merge Visible, this area stays transparent. So depending on how you're going to putz around with your image, this can be an important distinction. And having that filled in white can sometimes confuse certain types of content aware fill, so I usually like to leave it blank. Now we want to fill in this empty space around it, and the easiest way to do it is to actually select our image and then invert our selection. So I'm going to Command click right here, so I have everything selected. And then I'm going to come up to, then I want to invert my selection. I want to, here, let's take a look why. So I'm going to zoom in. And in this case, notice how we have this nice hard pixel edge. If you are doing what we're doing here for a different step, so let's say that I was doing this on like a drawing and I had done a little bit of stuff like this on it. Notice how there's this kind of soft transition of pixel right here rather than the hard pixel edge. So this is my anti-aliasing. So while there is a little anti-aliasing right there. So while this next step where we're going to bring the selection in a little bit isn't strictly necessary, when you get these little anti-aliased areas, it will be a very important step, because otherwise you end up with these transparent pixel line and it looks really bad. Okay, so anyway, I have a command click, so I have it selected. And now I want to fill in this area around it. So I'm going to go to, well, first let's invert the selection, my bad. So we'll click right here or hit Command Shift I to invert my selection. So notice now that my marching ants are going around the outside. So now I have this empty space selected. Now I want to deal with the possible aliasing. Again, we did actually have a few transparent pixels in there, so this step is technically necessary now. And I'm going to go up to Select, Modify, and Expand, just kind of like what we did with the text in Chapter 2. I have found 5 pixels will usually get past any aliasing that's present in an image. And then I will go to Edit, Fill. I'm not going to do Content Aware Fill right here. This actually gives us a different result or tool. We'll look at this in Chapter 6. We just want regular fill. However, in regular fill, we're going to pick Content Aware. Again, they do slightly different things. That looks pretty good. I'll click Deselect. So this is not bad. Now, if I was going to do this professionally, I would come down here. Man, I don't like this new brush tool. That's irritating. Just give me this lasso. I would, come down here and I would want to deal with whatever is going on there. Like this would need to get fixed. So maybe I would just try, like a generative fill or something to get rid of it. For you guys, you can leave this for the book assignment because we haven't really covered how to get rid of or fix these kind of issues yet. Oh, generative fill worked beautifully. It's still got a little ghosting right here, so I would need to make that a little bit bigger. Or we could have some trees. We'll look at generative fill here pretty soon. It's a cool tool. Anyway, we need to save this. So we'll come up to File and we'll do Save a Copy. And just like what we did for the JPEG, I'm just going to pick one of these. So here's Pano JPEG 1. I'll go ahead and click on that. Boop. And this is a 13 image one. So I'll do -13, telling me all the images that went into it. It is still a JPEG in this case because we didn't bump up to 16-bit. So I can just click Save. And if you get this window, go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and close this image. Now, when I go down to Bridge, rinse and repeat, right click, label green, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 book files already done. Finally, we want to do our sky replacement. So we have 2 images here in our sky replacement. So like we have this nice foreground, and then we have this big moody momentous sky. And these pictures were taken pretty close to each other in time. I want to say like 20, 30 minutes. We could actually look. Let's pop it open and let's click on the first and second image. So that's at 9:04, 9:18. Yeah, look at that. See how cool that is? You can see when these things are taken. Same day, same storm. Anyway, let's go ahead and open these just in normal Camera Raw. So again, you could click the Camera Raw button. In my case, I'm going to right click, open with, and I'm going to open it in regular Photoshop instead of beta. So now I have my 2 images and I want to do some adjustments to both of them. So unlike where we weren't adjusting our images before combining them, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and edit these now. So I can apply I'm going to apply some general edits now, and then if I wanted to later, I could do further editing. All right, so this is going to be my ground layer and this is going to be my sky layer. So I'm going to make the foreground layer active. So my ground layer active. I'm going to go to optics, and I'm just going to go ahead and click both of these on. And if you click remove chromatic, do profile corrections on one, you'll want to do it on both, by the way. Up at light, I'm going to come up to exposure, and I'm going to do 1/8 of a stop, so 0.8. And I'm editing this looking at the ground, because again, the sky is going to go away, so I don't really care about how bad that looks right now. I'm going to go down to color, and we're going to do 4,930 for temperature and tint. We'll come down to effects, and in contrast, up in light, we'll do contrast 5, and then down here in effects for clarity, we'll do 5. Okay, I'm gonna make the sky layer active. Same game as before. Optics, yes, I would like to remove chromabs. Yes, I'd like to do profile corrections. Up in light, I'm going to do contrast 10, and I'm going to do whites 30. And then in color, I'm gonna go to temperature and tint, and I want we're just gonna bump tint only, and we're gonna bump that by 12. And then in effects, we're gonna bump clarity by 10. Okay, now here's going to be a little goofy. So we want to only open one of these in Photoshop and then load the other one in using the program. So I've got 2 images. So if I make this one active and I click open, what's going to happen is this one won't open because it's not active. If I shift clicked it, then it would open. But this one, the edits I made to it will be saved just as if like I'd clicked done. So if I have this one active and I click open, edits are saved to the sky one, and then this one opens in Photoshop. So I'll click open. In Photoshop, we have a really quick and easy way to do sky replacements. So back in the day, you used to have to select the sky and create a layer mask and blah, 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 blah. Now we go up to File, and we go to, or is it Edit? It's an Edit. And we go to Sky Replacement. In Sky Replacement, you can see that it has the image already loaded up for me from when I did the book demo. For you guys, what you will need to do is you'll need to click this drop down, and you'll click this Add button. You'll navigate to wherever the file is on your computer. Let's see, let's just do name. So this is going to be Sky Replacement, and here it is, Sky Replacement CR2. So Sky Replacement Sky, and I'll click open. Come on, Potato Shop, you can do it. It's mad because I'm asking it to do a sky replacement with a raw file instead of like a normal like JPEG or PNG or something. And now it's here for us to use. Again, mine's already here because it's from when I made the chapter, when I wrote the actual book, it remembered. For Shift Edge, so this will move the horizon up and down a little bit. We're going to do 45. And for Fade Edge, we're going to do 20. Fade Edge is basically atmospheric perspective. Sky brightness, it does look a little dark to me, so we're going to bump it up to 15. And then I could rebalance the temperature, or I could zoom it in and out or flip it using these other tools. Similarly, I can do further edits down to my foreground to kind of finish this kind of appearance. But honestly, this looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Finally, let's take a look at a type of tone edit that is very common in photography. To make this easier to see what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull out my Layers menu, and I'm going to drop it right here. Depending on the screen resolution that you have, it might not be necessary for you to pull it out, but it'll be easier for you to see what I'm doing with my screen zoomed in like it is. Notice here's all the things that it did for my sky replacement. Like, see like all the work it does? It's so cool. Anyway, I'm going to click the arrow to collapse that down because I don't necessarily need to see all that. So I want to make a selection based on percent gray, how bright or how dark something is. And the reason why I want to do that is I want to make this look a little bit richer and more saturated. And if I just came over to adjustments and I did like a hue saturation, gross things pretty quickly start happening to the color. Same thing if I go to adjustment and I do vibrance, it's not as bad as as I start scaling this up. You need to be above that layer. Thank you very much. But it still doesn't look very realistic or good, and it doesn't give me that contrast or punchiness that I want. So I'm going to make a selection based on how bright the whole image is, and then I'm going to darken just the midtones, and it's going to be really cool. All right, over here in the far right, I'm going to click on Channels. If your Channels panel is missing for whatever reason, come up to Window and grab Channels back. And I can click on this circle here in the bottom of the Channels panel, and it selects everything brighter than 50% gray. Now, like what we saw in previous chapters, if I come over to the adjustment layer and I make an adjustment layer, it will convert this to a layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and click Curves. We can see up here, it gives me my curves adjustment. And now I have a black and white version of my combined images right here as my layer mask. What this means is that as I do my changes to my image, it'll be biased towards the brighter tones versus the darker tones. So like notice as I click and drag on this, it darkens the image. And if I didn't have this layer mask, so I'm going to right and click and disable it for a minute, you can see that like my dark tones end up becoming way too dark as I'm working with this because my layer mask is disabled. But if my layer mask is enabled, notice how much less of an effect it has on those darker tones and how it's basically hitting all of those midtones. And this makes it really easy to create very vibrant, dynamic landscapes. How the curve tool works, by the way, is you click on this line and drag up or down to brighten. And so click on the line once and drag down a little bit over here on the left. And we have an input and output. So if you want yours to match mine exactly, for the input, you could do 60, and for the output, you could do 45. Then over on the right side of this line, I'm going to click and drag up. So now I have a point here and a point here. Notice that this one has a kind of cross going through it, and it's highlighted white, telling me that this is the active point. If you want yours to match mine, you could do input 190 and output 200. So this is what we call a classic contrast S-curve. So I made my darks darker and I made my brights brighter. And if we click it on and off, we can see that it is a subtle adjustment to the image that makes it a little bit punchier and appear a little bit more saturated. Really cool. Okay, let's save our edit as a PSD. And I can just click save because that'll default to PSD. And we can see it's labeled sky ground replacement foreground. So I'm going to delete out foreground. So it just says sky replacement and click save. If you get this, you can go ahead and say, don't show me that again and click OK. Come on, Potato Shop, you can do it. I know this is a big file. This is a big file because these are 5DS files and they're big 50 megapixel monsters. So Photoshop, like they're a little resource intensive. Well, that said, this is going a little slow, probably because I'm uploading multiple gigabyte video files right now to YouTube. When it's done saving, go ahead and click the X to make it go away, and then return to Bridge so we can see our images. Here is the new sky replacement. I'll go ahead and right click, and I'm going to label you green. And just like with the last one, if I was going to be delivering these to a client, I would want, well, one, I wouldn't want to be sending them DNGs. I'd want to convert these to JPEGs, but for us, this will be fine. We'd want to make a folder to put these in. So I'm going to right click in this empty space and pick new folder. Label this chapter 5-done. And I'm going to select my images. Now I could click on one, Command or Control click, or I could right click and I can do sort and I can do by label, and it puts all of my green images together. So now I can just click and shift click. So I've got all 5 images selected, and I will drag it into my done folder. And to create a deliverable zip file, I would right click on that folder and do compress to zip. And just like that, we have a file that would be appropriate to send to a client. Not so bad. All right, for this do-it-yourself, you should practice creating HDR and panorama photos in Adobe Camera Raw. You don't really need to do it in Photoshop because the JPEG one honestly just doesn't come up that often. And then you should create a similar sky replacement using the provided files as well. So for requirements, create your edited HDR, create your edited panorama, do a sky replacement that then is also edited in Photoshop using that luminosity mask trick. So again, you would go over and you would click the thing to select the lights and darks and go from there. When you're done, you should export your raw files and your JPEGs into a little separate folder that would be then compressed. Anyway, I hope it's fun and good luck.